John chapter 9. Getting close to finishing this account of the healing of the blind man. The whole chapter is given to this, just like in chapter 4 of John, the whole account essentially was given to or most of the Samaritan woman, because there was so much to discuss that was going on. Someone noted when I was reading about this chapter that this is one of the very few instances in the Gospel of John where Jesus isn't present and talking. He is at the beginning, and then there's a huge section where Jesus isn't there. And then Jesus comes in at the end, and then, speaking of end, ends in an odd way, at least it would seem. And it's very important for us, if you're trying to think of how to keep this organized in your head, and I know we all have a different filing system when it comes to how we organize things in our heads, but don't allow your brain to make any or much of a chapter break at the end of chapter 9 going into chapter 10. From what we can tell, and I think it's just about 100% certain, there really is no chapter break. No topic break, I should say. Of course, there was no chapter break in the original. But no true break in topic. This is still continuing on right after what Jesus says at the end of chapter 9, going into chapter 10. And even chapter 10, I'm a bit surprised at how I've had some presuppositions about chapter 10, Jesus the Good Shepherd, and yet the challenges that have come because so much more is stated. Even verse 6 is interesting, why John adds that Jesus is speaking in a different way, using another type of allegory that's not a parable. It's not the typical word for parable, and many were not understanding. And I started to say, well, I've got some questions myself, because in chapter 10, he's not just the shepherd, the good shepherd, he's the door to the sheepfold. And in watching why that's stated and why that's brought up first, so we'll be building on some of those things. But I say all that to say, let's keep on track as we go through to realize we are going to make a break even in the notes to get to chapter 10, but there's a flow of thought that continues all the way through this section. Chapter 9 of John, verse 24, so a second time they called the man who had been blind and said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." How does he respond? He therefore answered, "Whether he's a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know," just trying to stand, let me just give testimony to what I know, "that whereas I was blind, now I see." They said therefore to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" We dealt with this last week. Verse 27, he answered them, "I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again?" These are fair questions. I'm kind of reading some frustration into it. Maybe there wasn't, but I sense frustration. "You do not want to become his disciples too, do you?" We're going to deal with that in a moment. And they reviled him and said, "You are his disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we don't know where he's from." And this is where the man is, I believe, genuinely surprised. The man answered and said to them, "Well, here's an amazing thing, that you do not know where he is from, and yet he opened my eyes. And why is this so amazing? We know that God does not hear sinners. But if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he hears him. Since the beginning of time, it has never been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." A lot stated here by this beggar, a man who had been blind. They answered and said to him, and this is a brutal put down, to use how we would put it. This is brutal in what they say. It may not seem like that on the surface, but we'll explain it in a little bit. They answered and said to him, "You were born entirely in sins." Well, why distinguish how he was born in sin versus them? It's a good question we'll get to. And you, this one born entirely in sins, and we know how we know, we'll get to that, are teaching us? And they kicked him out. They put him out. Which I believe is the excommunication they already had been threatening that his parents knew. Verse 35, Jesus heard they had put him out, and finding him, he said, And this is a question directly toward faith. This is not a question that so many people read into it. Do you believe in the Son of God or the Son of Man, the one that actually healed you of your blindness? Jesus is going to a fundamental theological question the Jews would have all known about. Do you actually believe in the Messiah, the anointed one of God? Do you believe in the Son of Man? It's also in many Son of God. There's a textual variant there. Either way, it works. Verse 36, he answered and said, "And who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" Now some translate Lord there, which is kurios, at the root at least, which can be translated Lord or Sir. Many translators say there's actually a way that this is stated in the context. It should be translated Sir. I don't think anybody's trouble with translating it Lord. Verse 37, Jesus said to him, "You have both seen him," which is fabulous to be able to say, those eyes that were blind. You've seen him. "And he's the one who's talking to you." So how does this man respond? "And he said, 'Lord, I believe,' and he worshiped him." Verse 39, and Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." This is a type of judgment. Those are the Pharisees who were with him, so they're seeing all this, including what happened to this man and the discussion there, heard these things and said to him, "We are not blind too, are we?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But since you say, 'We see,' your sin remains. It stays. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter by the door into the fold of the sheep, but climbs up some other way, he is a thief and a robber." And then it goes. Any idea who he might be lumping into this category of thieves and robbers coming into the sheepfold, which we'll talk about? Could it possibly be these Pharisees, these spiritual leaders, who actually are not shepherds, but are thieves and robbers? And they're going to get this, that this is what he's talking about, this is what he's pointing to, and that is the case. They are. Look how they've treated this little sheep, and what they've done, and how they came at it, and why they were doing what they were doing. This is the judgment Jesus would bring with him. He's not talking about the Son of Man judgment we've already seen later, where he will truly judge everything in the end. He will. This is a different type of judgment now, which is now just his very presence on earth, and by what he says and what he does automatically brings with it a judgment ahead of time. In this case, those who are blind and know they're blind will be able to see. That's a result of it. And those who think they can see will be proven to be blind. Though it's hard to convince a person who's blind and doesn't know they're blind that they're blind, especially since everything they have around them they think equates to whatever sight is. In the notes, we run toward the top of page 66. We ended at point E. His answer was still focused when he answers the group of Pharisees when he's called in the second time. His answer was still focused, and they did not know what they were setting up. I mean, typically, if you have this much power, and they're already seeing other people kind of cower away because they're afraid of the power that they can do. And again, what was the power they had? They could excommunicate them. They could make them suffer. And so often people who are in leadership lead out of power, not out of truth. And there's lots of that through human history, where people lead out of power, not out of truth. And that's what they were counting on here. And you would think, this man's been a beggar, he was a blind man, he must be a simpleton, if anyone's just going to yield unto the power. And they're getting more and more frustrated that he won't. He actually seems to want to explore this incident. And then, to answering back their astonishment, he has an astonishment. I'm astonished that, having seen what's gone on and having no precedence for this before, that you're not interested in exploring it any further. That's a bit astonishing too, isn't it? That you're not more taken with this to figure out what was going on. It is astonishing at what doesn't astonish people. isn't it? Sometimes it's astonishing at what does not astonish certain people. You're thinking, how can anybody look at this and not say, wow, this deserves my full attention? And then other people will come and sit and think, I'm not impressed. I don't say anything here. And that's an incredible thing. So you see two sides of astonishment. I find that somewhat astonishing. Sorry, the use of the term there. I think it's also key off to the left of point E there. This is common in theological discussions. We still see this type of thing going on. It's common in theological discussions as well, where the, quote, victory, however you want to define it. You ever heard of these debates and people go at it with each other? It's kind of like in politics. We see it all the time. Both come to report back to their people, and they say, we won. And the other says, we won. And you think, wait a minute, everybody always wins. It's the same in theological circles. Everybody always wins in their arguments. Nobody ever loses. Even when it has become clear certain sides at times have lost, it doesn't seem clear to them, which is a whole nother point. This is common in theological discussions as well, where the so-called victory is determined in tripping the other up or catching them being inconsistent somehow, as though somehow that wins the argument. You stumbled over your words. You mixed something up. You didn't quite accurately say something or a fact. I mean, that happens in politics, which has whatever effects. In theological circles, it happens all the time, and people automatically say, see, we won. You made a mistake. You didn't use this term right. You misspoke. You got a fact wrong. Well, if we're truly all looking for the absolute right answer, the truth in the matter, is that going to stop our discussion? Not if we actually want to know the right answer. Which then kind of gives us a clue, wait a minute, maybe a lot of people don't actually want the right answer. And that's the point. They don't actually want the right answer. So we see that happening here. They want to trip somebody up more than actually working through to the clear truth. So point F, the man's response can be taken as a point of sarcasm. Many do take it as a sarcasm, as though he's just kind of poking fun at them. Or it could be taken as a point of boldness. I'm with that. Or as a sincere curiosity. I'm with that one. As to whether or not these might actually be reconsidering Jesus. And I want to make a point of this because it's too easy just to say, he knows what's going on, and he's making fun of them. I am not willing to yield the point. I think we actually might be looking at another way we ought to be thinking about people. I may think, you're just a bunch of idiots, and I'm going to have fun with you. Not when it comes to this stuff. Not when it comes to theological. I'm not out to have fun with someone and we all get a good laugh over how they stumbled through their theological concepts. This happens all the time. And how crazy people are in getting certain scriptures wrong totally. It's not a laughing matter. It may astonish us to a point of, it comes out of our mouth, but it's not something we genuinely think this would make a good comedic story to share with my friends. And I would like to kind of lean toward the point that he might be thinking, okay, well, maybe there might be some interest. Now, we know in retrospect there was no interest at all. They're going to revile him. But maybe he did think they're going to actually consider because they called him back a second time. They want more details. So he's asking them, maybe they want to be, and he asked them outward, maybe they want to be his disciple. So it could be sarcasm, boldness, a sincere curiosity as to whether or not these might actually be reconsidering Jesus. He seems frustrated when he replies that he already told them, and apparently they didn't listen. So why would they want to hear it again? This isn't the point, right? Why would you want to hear it again? Could it be that they are considering actually becoming his disciples? Could it be? Now, I could see how people would just laugh that can't even be possible unless this guy was naive, but it could be. Even though such interrogations usually are designed as traps, we don't expect everybody to know it's a trap. And even if the majority of a group that's trying to entrap me, or this man in this case, or any of us, might be just designed for that, we don't know who else is listening, who else is hearing. Just to be quite open with you, over the years, we've had different people come and go in the church setting and in other settings where there's a lot to put up with. They're very critical, they're very tough, they're very, unfair from my vantage point about a lot of different things. But there's still a bearing with them because of family, for instance. The husband or the wife that's still around, the children that are still there. And me personally, I try to have that affect how I think, because it's easy to say, enough of this, be gone. But then you think, but there's other people in the family that are there. And isn't it worth putting up with some of this because someone, at least one of them, maybe a few, they might actually be open to listening even if others aren't. And I like to try to think that there could be even a possibility like this with this man to go ahead and take a stand and say these things, because we already know there's already some doubt in this group. This man doesn't necessarily know it. We know it. So I don't want to just write it off as being, sarcasm, he's kind of poking fun at him. Let's at least give some opportunity that there might be some of them that might be interested, at least from this man's vantage point. Could it be they're reconsidering being his disciples? Even though such interrogations usually are designed as traps, we should allow the possibility that the interrogator might be inwardly struggling to come to the truth. And I don't know. I sincerely try. I'm not perfect personally on this. I don't think that's disputable. I'm not perfect on this, but I try to think that possibly the reaction I get from certain people, or the reaction we might see in other people, might be just the emotional response to, or they're trying to grapple with the truth and surrendering to it. Try to be patient within reason. I mean, after a while, it just becomes a point where, okay, we try to assume, and then after a while, it's just not the case. But we try. That possibly that's why someone's reacting, and it's very easy to react to a reaction. But this man puts it out, maybe they want to be his disciple. Point G, they react though, and we would normally expect it. And how do they react? With a positional separation from him. Well, clearly, we're arguing here, but we're not on the same level. We're not on the same level. And people will say, well, that happens a lot in churches too. You've got, I'm the pastor. You're just the parishioner, if we use such a term. And how dare we? Well, scripturally speaking, people of the congregation are supposed to acknowledge and respect the authority of the elders. They are told to do that. But we're never told that the elders are there to enforce it. There's the problem on the other side. People ought to. We went through this in Titus. We see this in Hebrews. We see this in Timothy, where there's supposed to be an authority and an authority structure, and it's supposed to be acknowledged, but we're never told the authority is supposed to enforce their own personal authority. So, when we're disagreeing with someone, they might seem to be less on their level of education, less on their level of understanding, less on their level of study, and we might be absolutely right on that, but you still have to meet them where they're at. We never want to take a condescending approach to people, especially when it comes to theological discussions, and there's plenty of those people out there, where they will come and say, well, as long as you remember, I'm the professor, I'm the theologian, I'm the pastor, I'm more studied than you. As long as we realize that's the case, even if that's, and it likely is the case, but it doesn't change the discussion. You still have to deal with, surprise, the content of what's being discussed. It's either right or wrong. So if someone who has no degree at all, who can't read and write, and who can barely talk and uses poor grammar and that, if essentially what they say is true, it's true. And then we got to deal with it there. We got to deal with face value. It's at least one point we walk away with, rather than thinking, well, clearly you're beneath me, I don't need to have this discussion with you. That's what the Pharisees did. We don't want to be like them. Jesus talked to anybody, including the Pharisees, and was still pushing for the truth, even though he of all knew where it was headed. So they react from a positional separation from him when they say, you are his disciple, while they, as they confidently assert, we are the disciples of Moses, at least the Moses of their own making. For as Jesus has already pointed out, Moses wrote of him, of Jesus, Moses will judge them in light of this. That's in John 5:45-47. He's already said that. Either they weren't there or they're just disregarding it. These men are already appealing back to Moses. So point H, they seem to forget how often their forefathers actually resisted Moses. I think we love to superimpose ourselves back in history and say, if I was back there, I would have been. Well, good thing we weren't back there. God in his infinite wisdom knew we didn't belong there. So why do we even go there? That somehow we would have responded right. We would have set the situation right. That's never healthy thinking. I belong in the time I'm in. I don't want to start scrutinizing that God maybe had me born at the wrong time. They seem to forget how often their forefathers actually resisted Moses, questioning Moses' authority and questioning the authority and the accuracy of God's prophets. There is a tendency in most of us to suppose the truth of a matter will just seem obvious to us. I can't state that strong enough. That may seem like, I'm not sure I follow you. I'm not sure I understand that. I believe, I think Dan's alluded to this in other ways, that we think if something's true, I'll just know it. And if something's false, I'll just know it. I'll just be able to spot it. I mean, we presume upon some innate knowledge in us, some innate perception in us, that we'll look on something and say, well, clearly that's wrong. And if we could really work them down to why they think it's wrong, once we get past the superficial stuff, we'll find out they know it's wrong because they feel it's wrong. I just don't like it. I have had a few people in my past where we've been disagreeing over certain theological things, and they finally said, Don, I feel like it's wrong. It just doesn't feel right. And you try to say, but that's not what it comes down to, right? That's not really where we're at. I know a lot of things won't feel right, but what part of us is doing the feeling anyway? If my pride, which is often a natural, predominant part of so much of my natural thinking, thinks it doesn't feel right, then I'm wrong if I side with my pride. So there's a side of us that thinks it will just seem obvious to us, knowing the truth, and that it will have a sense of being naturally easy. Well, it can't be right. I can't explain it, but I just know it's not right. But this is not the case with most things in life. Now, I'll be fair. There have been times in my life where I felt like something's not right. I can't explain it, and then ends up it wasn't right. But that's not the authority we base anything on. We go on off to the left there. This does help, at least as an example, at least thinking of it this way to consider the possibility. This does help as an example of how important foundational training, foundational influences can be, because, or for, if it is the standard by which we compare most things, and there's certainly a greater level of importance. We may think, well, our kids are just picking things up, but we forget, how do I know right and wrong as I'm going from a thinking perspective? I compare it to something, right? How do I know what's right and wrong? I compare it to what I've been brought up with. I think it's not right to wear spring colors in winter. No, you shouldn't do that. That's just wrong. Okay, can you back that up? Well, I mean, if you look at those color charts and the shadows it cast on your face with certain colors at certain times, with certain paleness of skin, we go on and say, no, that's not the point. But if suddenly that's made a priority in somebody's life, then we come into a church gathering and perish the thought somebody in the middle of January is wearing spring colors. We're thinking, I think you've done something wrong here. Now, they're not doing anything wrong. There's nothing wrong. And I'm using a ridiculous example to try to just make the point, but if that's a foundational thought, if I really think that's wrong, it's going to have some consequences. Okay, well, we don't really think that way. Maybe not. Maybe I've stumbled onto something. No, we don't really think that way, but there's a lot of other foundational thoughts that can trip us up, just like the traditional way of thinking was tripping up these Pharisees, but they were certain of things they should not be certain of. And they were certain of how it was presented, and they weren't certain necessarily of the actual texts from what Moses did and actually said and actually taught. They were certain of the twice, 3 times, 4 times removed handlings of these texts. Yes, Colleen?
Isn't it interesting that the original temptation for Adam and Eve was basically wanting to be able to just know?
Yeah, it's true. That was the core of the initial temptation. I just want to know. And it wasn't just a theoretical knowing. It was, I kind of want to know from firsthand experience. And we all know that's the best way of learning, because who wants someone to come in and teach you if they don't have firsthand experience? And I understand there's some value to that, but it doesn't mean someone who doesn't have firsthand experience can't teach us. I think a lot of people use that as an excuse when they don't like the class they're in. Well, you don't have real-world experience. Well, there's some value to real-world experience, but it could bias you another way. That's another point, though, when it comes to theology. So it's not necessarily going to be obvious to us. The rest of that point off to the left, these had what they thought, and they were confident in it, they had what they thought was a reliable standard without realizing that even with the credentials of Moses that they were using with all certainty and all confidence, true as the credentials of Moses actually were, and they were true credentials, the actual teaching and reason for what Moses gave them had already been infiltrated, had already been distorted with self-righteous ends. So they're appealing to Moses. Moses did have legitimate credentials. He really did have words from God. But they didn't understand them, these words from God. They were wrongly taught based on these things. So let me ask, how do you know if you've been rightfully taught? How do you know you've been taught right? Well, let's just deal with it in church. I have a bachelor's degree hanging up in my office back there. Does that guarantee you you're being accurately taught? Well, these days, what's a bachelor's degree? If I had a doctorate back there, would it be any sure? No, you wouldn't. You'd still have to scrutinize what was being taught, which we never stopped doing. So I think we can see how it's easy to get to a point, well, I've been in church and being taught for 30-something years. I think I'm pretty solid on this. Well, one side of that statement, I would say, yeah, you better be. But I wouldn't put my confidence in the 30 years. You might come up with another topic you've not dealt with, another text you've never been confronted with. I still find that with text after text, even when I was discovering in my study this past week in John chapter 10. Point I, these Pharisees did not, nor would they recognize his true credentials. Because what do they say? Speaking of Jesus' true credentials, they said, as for this man, we do not know where he is from. Some in their ranks knew where he was from, as far as his earthly presence, in the earthly sense there, John 7:27. But the from here ultimately points to the actual person, the character of the person, the heart of the person, the drive of the person, more than their earthly credentials. We just don't trust this guy. We don't know where this guy's coming from, we might put it. We just don't know where he's coming from. Point J, the formerly blind man's response in verses 30 through 33 is again bold and honest, because he's not being swayed by the driving influence of these opposers. And let's again not miss the point. There are many who will lead from a position of power and power alone. There's plenty of those to be had. Don't just limit that to politics. Certainly realize it takes place in spiritual circles. So what does this man do? He calls it, quote, an amazing thing, that these who have so much authority and so much knowledge don't actually know. And part of this amazement, and apparently did not seem concerned to know, especially based on what took place. For how could they disregard or have no motivation to look into this further, since this was the first of its kind miracle? It does merit looking more into it. Now, they can dismiss this guy and say, how dare you try to teach us? The better response to someone who's truly ignorant, trying to teach someone who's truly informed, is to correct the person who's trying ignorantly to change what's being discussed. And it's not a matter of just saying, I'm above you, you're beneath me. That's not an answer. That's not an answer. You actually have to deal with the content, with what was said, what was right, what was wrong, why it was wrong. Off to the left, with a plain thinker, their motives and objective became more apparent in the shock of their not being more impressed with what had taken place. I think that's fair to say, someone who's just thinking normally, kind of in a plain sense, that, okay, yeah, I kind of with the guy who used to be blind, thinking they should have been investigating this more. They prejudged this. This is an amazing thing that they weren't going to go into this any further. Makes me suspicious. I mean, look what happens in the political realm. Looks like something bad came up. And oftentimes one of the first responses on either side comes up and says, it's just a trick to distract from the other side. And it may be. But even in just normal senses, you think, yeah, but you're going to have to answer it to some degree, right? As foolish as it is and as made up as it might be, you still have to kind of answer it somehow. I understand the point of not getting sucked into this and then letting it, write out the rest of your term living in a constant defense, but you still have to answer it. And if people act like, no, we don't want to go there, that automatically makes plain thinkers think, maybe something's up. I kind of wonder how many conspiracy theories are just fed because people don't respond to them. I understand with some people, no matter how often you respond, their fuel or their fire is fueled no matter what. But in this case, this is a very legitimate concern. How could you not be looking into this? This seems crazy that you would be looking into this any further. This is an amazing thing. He's not exaggerating. I'm astonished that you're not looking into this further. I underlined at that point off to the left, the last part of it. It's hard to be impressed with the working of God. And I think we know this is at their heart. It's hard to be impressed with the working of God when the working of God is not in line with our personal opinions or goals. If it doesn't fit our picture. I remember back in our study in Matthew, some were pretty direct with me. I don't know if it's anyone that's here now, but when we went through that and the master casts out the person who wasn't properly attired, and someone was just saying, I really found that one hard to swallow. And when you get down to it, the reason I found it hard to swallow, it just seemed mean. It just seemed mean. And then we get into it more, yeah, but why? What was going on? A good illustration of that point would be, what would you think if someone who wasn't out of their mind, but someone who was in their right mind, maybe was pretty proud, came to a wedding, and let's say it's a woman, because it's the only way it's going to fit my illustration, and the woman comes in dressed in a bridal gown, but she's not the one getting married. Most people are going to think, well, you've crossed some serious lines here. You're not here to outshine the bride. We would think that's offensive. Well, in the case of the feast that was being done and people coming, it was a disgrace, it was a mockery, it was irreverent to do something like that, and it all happens to be just weren't looking on it the right way. But it's easy to think that way. I look at a text, I see what it says, and I think, I don't feel good about that text. but we'd better look into it more before we reach a conclusion. So these don't like what Jesus is saying, they don't like what he's done, but this certainly merited more research. Point K, even common people, however you want to define that, know that God does not hear sinners. That was true. God doesn't hear sinners. People say, what about the sinner's prayer? That's not the point of theological discussion here. Generally speaking, God doesn't hear sinners. Not in a way, certainly not in a way that would equate to such a miracle. Some, trying to get around this, point out the magic of the Egyptians that they performed to mimic what Moses has done. I've seen this in some of my reading. Well, there were other things that were impressive, and you can kind of see how they might have thought, well, we don't have to look into this. This is just another trick, kind of like the magicians did with Moses. But this was no magic trick, and a healing of this type had never been done. And even if they thought, well, we'll still think it's a magic trick, but none ever like this had ever taken place. And then they couldn't get around not just the miracles that Jesus was doing time and time again, but they couldn't get around what he was teaching, what Jesus was actually teaching. So for how could they disregard or have no motivation to look into this further, since it was the first of this kind miracle? Even common people know God doesn't hear sinners. Some point to the magic of the Egyptians, but this was no magic trick. So, point L, if in answer to their voiced conclusion, or as if in answer to their voiced conclusion, that Jesus was a sinner, what does this man do? And he kind of answers it the best he can. This man calculates. Okay, I don't know if I can give you a direct answer, but let me try to calculate based on what we know. And here's how he calculates. That Jesus must be a God-fearing man, so that counters the whole sinner presumption, and one who must then be doing God's will for him to have been able to perform such a miracle. So he must be one that God hears. And so from the best this man can calculate, it sure seems like these are the facts I'm going to go with. I don't see how I'm even going to go close to you're assuming he was a sinner. Let's just look at what's going on here. And I'm trying to demonstrate this because, as Jesus is about to point out, these who proclaim to be seers were blind. They were blind. And this is how blind people get around it. They argue another point. They argue another topic. This happens all the time, and they can still sound intellectual and authoritative. This happens constantly in theological circles, where people are arguing theology, but they're arguing all over the place, not from let's just face it at face value. Is man depraved? Is God sovereign? Will the Lord Jesus return? Is there even a Trinity? We can start there and work through these basic concepts, but we're so deep into the deepest of deepest weeds, arguing some other points that have almost little to no practical value, though they can envision the destruction of the church if we somehow go off track with some of these things, that we don't even know the plain facts anymore. And I'm saying this as a person who likes the theological debate, sees some value in a lot of it, but oftentimes we're so off track we're missing the main point. This man is just a plain guy saying, with these great intellects, these people of great power, with great studies, and he's saying, well, I can't say he's a sinner. Seems like a God-fearing man's the only one that could do this. Someone of God's the only one that God would hear and allow him to do such a thing. He must be of God. There's a safe place to start, at least. They couldn't counter it. Because we're about to look at this great counter they come up with. This genius response they come up with. No, they do what a lot of people do that have some position, or at least they think they have some position of authority and power. Once they are cornered, they pull out the authority ticket, card, to try to play it. So, what happens? Off the left, point L, this demonstrates that the work of God's Spirit, this demonstrates what the work of God's Spirit in someone looks like. Even while being pushed to think against Christ, which it looks like most people were just immediately bowing to. He was being pushed to think against Christ. It only causes the focus of this man on the revelation that Jesus is the opposite of what his opponents claim him to be. This is true faith at work. This is the true work of the Holy Spirit. We're the ones that treat it as though everybody's uber fragile, and unless you get it just right, they'll never quite come to Christ, when in reality, throw everything you can against it, it won't stop it. It won't stop it. This man, clearly the work of God was in his life. We're going to see him later fully admit it, that Jesus truly is his Lord, and worships. And we can look back and say, well, wait a minute, when did they work in all this theological background stuff? I don't think he was, they're just talking moments, hours maybe, but where did he learn all this stuff? I don't get it. And yet his faith was real, because his faith comes the working of God, not from some mustering up inside of himself in this man. A couple more points. I can see some fatigue and tiredness, but this is very important. So I'm just acknowledging it, not to make you even more tired. I'm just saying, stay with me. Stay with me. Don't let me lose you. I can't think of a point yet I think is worthy of skipping. So just bear with me. We may get through it and you think, no, you could have skipped that one, Don. But just hear me out. Point M, the evidence he points to is that no one since the beginning of time has had blindness, especially his kind. Blindness from birth that they were fighting against. They've never had it cured. So if, quote, this man were not from God, end quote, there is no way he could do what he's done. And so, quote, he could do nothing. And that's typically the translation of this text, and it's an accurate one. He couldn't have done anything. Certainly none of this magnitude. He couldn't have done this. He couldn't have healed of a hangnail, let alone blindness, if he was not truly of God. So point M, the response of the Jews is extremely unkind when they say you were born entirely, that's halos, wholly, completely in sin, as though somehow they weren't. It's an interesting way of berating him, belittling him in a seemingly theological sense. You were born entirely in sin, for this was not a reference to original sin, but was a, quote, not so subtle reference to his being born blind. So it's easy to look on and say, listen, buddy. Normally an affectionate term, so often used in certain circles to put somebody down. Listen. Can't you see now, you were the one born blind, you were the beggar. Clearly, you had issues. And remember how this whole chapter began? When they first see him, Jesus is coming by this blind man, and the disciples say, why is this man born blind? Was it his parents or was it his? Because it had to be sin. That was a common thought. So here are the Pharisees looking on and saying clearly, we weren't the ones born blind. We weren't born in sin. Look at you. We're going to listen to you. Like Rahab this morning. Who would possibly use Rahab, especially so early on in her exhibition of faith and her coming to faith, or whatever you want to say it? How would we ever use her as a positive example? But how could we ever listen to you? They only said this because they could not counter what he was saying. Because he was stating plain facts. Generally known facts. So deep as they could get in any intellectual argument, theological argument, they couldn't handle fundamental thoughts. Basic thinking they couldn't handle. Sometimes that's what trips up the best of them. Basic thinking they couldn't handle. It wasn't original sin. It was pointing out him being born blind. It was common, as was seen at the start of this chapter, to equate such birth defects to particular sins. Someone's born with a mental impairment. What do we think? You must be stupid. Now, we wouldn't say it that way because that's not polite, and it isn't. But how do we know? Someone may have a brain issue, a handicap of some sort, and may not be able to talk clearly. They may sound ignorant in how they speak. I kind of like to compare it to, not in a judgmental way, to people that come from a foreign country and have trouble speaking English. They just don't sound smart, most of them. And yet, probably some of the brightest people, because they've actually learned a lot of our language, far more than any of us can say, already proving themselves to be smarter than we are in certain capacities. And yet it's easy to think, you just don't sound smart. That's not a smart way of responding to someone. Because even in the simplicity of some people who haven't been taught well, sometimes the most basic, obvious answer is the answer we have to grapple with. And we're demonstrating the use of our great intellectual abilities to skirt around the point we ought to be dealing with. This man is a great example of that. Off to the left, it is still common for us to consider that when someone looks to be so-called unlucky, or someone is unfortunate in their physical or life situations, it's the same thing with the parents today. If you're attractive, it's weird how some people think you must just be smarter. And if you're not so attractive, it's amazing how some people think, well, clearly you're not that smart. Look at you. That's not always the case, but oftentimes it is the case. So it's not uncommon. It's going to happen far more than that. We look on someone who looks unlucky or unfortunate in their physical life or life situation to associate it with their personal responsibility in their sin. Well, clearly I wasn't born blind. You were born blind. I must already have a head start on you. Well, that's not the case. That's ridiculous to think that way. But it's easy to let ourselves think that way. Well, look at your life. Look at your life. And even if they have messed it up, it doesn't mean I can now dismiss everything they say. Now, I understand there's some people that have messed up their lives and they still sound forth their erroneous ways as though there's somehow an answer. Well, you don't have to listen to that, but you still deal with it in its content. But just because someone's born with a birth defect doesn't mean that somehow they're less than any of us in their standing with God. Just because I'm more physically fit than somebody else who was born with a defect, if I can beat a person who was born without a leg in a race, what does that say about me? It's nothing to be impressed with. And yet we'll say, well, that's laughable with that analogy there, but yet so often we'll do just what these folks do. And look, you were born in a poor family, you didn't have as good a financial situation as I have, you don't have the education that I have, I don't have to regard anything you say. No, I think if you have an education, you are more obligated to answer the simpletons, if we look on it that way. You're more obligated to answer them. You must answer them, not dismiss them. It could be, as seen here, someone placed in very difficult circumstances in order for God to be glorified in it, and then our disdain of them becomes the worst kind of prejudice because we're discounting God's purpose in whatever their issue is. So someone might have a learning disorder. It does not mean they can't learn. It doesn't mean they can't understand. Point O, almost there. Using their presumptive conclusion that one born blind must be particularly sinful. Thus, their use of utterly and entirely, the word should be use there, their use of utterly and entirely, utterly born in sin, entirely born in sin, they react themselves now as if in astonishment that he of all people would seek to teach them. There's really just not a call for us to respond that way. I don't doubt there will be people who are expounding on their ignorance, and they are the epitome of people expounding on their ignorance that may come to teach everybody else, but we never posture ourselves as though I'm above, you're beneath, accept it. I might have an aboveness in position or experience, but we still have to address what's being stated. Hopefully I'm saying this enough for this to get through. If only they would have said, okay, we just don't think you have any right to teach us, but let's deal with you. Was he a God-fearing man? Could a God-fearing man do this? Could he have done anything like this? Was it the first time a miracle like this ever took place? Should we explore it? Okay, that would at least have been a little bit more intellectually honest. But no, they immediately pull rank, at least as they envisioned it. They reacted astonishment as that he of all people would seek to teach them, and yet, one point we don't want to miss, they have maybe in an unconscious way yielded a point. What is unique about this reaction is what it reveals. That they have now conceded the point that he actually was born blind. They've had to concede it. Remember, they were fighting as part of their strategy to fight off, okay, well, maybe he wasn't born blind. And we were sure he was blind. Okay, he was blind. Maybe he wasn't born blind. And now there's a conceding, no pushing back, on that he was actually born blind. Point P, this also demonstrates then that we must be careful not to write off what someone is saying just because of their situation, or that we presume they are less blessed than we are. That's a dangerous way of looking on life, and let's not all act as though we're above it. It's easy for us to think this way. I mean, all the way back to the James 2 scenario, if someone just isn't dressed as nicely as we are, we think, clearly I'm already above you. And all kinds of other superficial things which stifle useful talk. So what is stated, what is actually stated, must be dealt with and handled in its content. Let's hope I've said that so many times we think, okay, all right, I get it. What is stated, I have to deal with it in its content. So then we end with the top of page 67. It was a personal goal of mine to make it to this page. Here we are. Having in their pride placed themselves highly above this man, they not only dismiss his statements and his testimony, they then put him out. They put him out. And I think this is likely full excommunication. He could not talk with these religious leaders plainly. Why? Why could he not talk with these religious leaders plainly on basic thoughts, basic truths, since his motive was not to do what so many people do? His motive was not to determine what they wanted him to say and then say it. That is, I fear, a lot of people's motives. Okay, I'm listening. What is it you want me to say? All right, I'm going to say it now. I'm going to say it. And then parrot it back, and maybe not necessarily in a parroting way, but they say it back because they want to hear it. Instead, he was driven to know the truth regarding the one who healed him. That was the point. I fear it's easy to miss that point, that that's what was going on. They didn't want to get to the truth. Now, to pull it home, fair question to ask. Do we really want to hear the truth? And I know the answer, yes, I want to hear the truth. No, really. Do we want to hear the truth? And let me just preface this before we answer it, and you don't have to answer it. But realizing that when we hear the truth, quite often, if not most often, it will be naturally disagreeable to us. It will be humbling to us. It will be difficult to hear. It will involve action. It will not only hurt my pride, it will counter my laziness. Now, honestly, do we want to hear the truth? And hopefully our answer is yes. And we would say why, because I desperately need to be corrected. I desperately need to be challenged. I need to be pushed. I don't want to get in a situation where I'm coddled because I know what's going to happen. I don't want to be pushed, but I need to be pushed. That's maturity. That's being a grown-up. Being a child is, I don't like being pushed. I'm going to make sure I'm in a situation where I don't get pushed, because that's how children talk, right? I don't want to get in a situation where I'm pushed or anybody challenges me. I want people to think nice of me. It's not what it's about. It's about being in the right, even if it's harsh and difficult circumstances. And again, they may come from the nicest people, but if someone tells us we're wrong, there's just no easy way to have that told to us. There's no easy way to have it stated to us. I need these things. And so these folks were not willing to do it because they were comfortable for whatever reason in their position, confident in their position, did not want to hear Christ. They may have theologically and morally justified themselves by saying that they were protecting the people, but they were doing the opposite from God. So next week, we're going to begin with point F, the blind made to see and the seeing made blind. Yes, Matt?
Point Q is exactly what I was thinking. They didn't intend for him to really answer the question, honestly. They really wanted him to parrot their response, the glory to God.
Right.
And that was his only usefulness to them would be to parrot what they said.
Yeah, that's right.
And that strategy continues very strongly in today's world. We were talking about it before service started. That mentality continues. And people are challenging you, and the only right answer is their answer.
Right.
Your usefulness is only in when you agree with them.
I think of, shows the childish side of my mind sometimes, but I think back to a sweatshirt I bought my mother some years ago. Many years ago, we used to have fun with the directness of my mother so many times, and so it fits so well. Mom, if you're listening to this, it's funny still. But we bought her this sweatshirt that had a picture of Garfield the cat on it, kind of looking, smug, saying, when I want your opinion, I'll give it to you. And I think, yeah, that's kind of where so many people in that position are actually like. It's like Matt was saying, that just seems to be so often what it is. We've worked it out. Now, say what we want you to say. I'm all for doctrinal statements. But I'm amazed at the number of groups that are unwilling to have true challenges come. Is it okay if somebody challenges our doctrinal statement? Absolutely it is. Absolutely it is. And if we can't defend it and can't at least try to convince the people in some way, then something's wrong with us. Now, if someone's defiantly doing it and saying, too bad, so sad, the mature response people often have, then there's another story about another situation there with the attitude and things. But if someone says, I just don't know if God is as sovereign as you say he is, that's a good question. That's a good thing to be concerned about.